Why and from whom do Australians build such a huge number of fences? Rumors circulate online that horrific things are concealed behind them. A passage to the center of the Earth, a secret passage to Antarctica, a city of running Nazis, New Swabia, and creatures the size of a 5-story building. In general, at least, the edge of the flat Earth. But what really lies beyond the fence in Australia? We'll tell you all about it right now. Let's go. What's hidden behind the fence? So you understand the scale of the problem. Only on the 2 largest fences in Australia, which are more than 3,000 and 5,000 kilometers long, the government spends about $7 million annually. And the fine for an uncovered gate for local residents reaches up to $2,500. Originally, the reason for building fences was simple. They were erected to protect against rabbits, which by the end of the century had overrun the state of Western Australia. Initially, only this territory was fenced off. Rabbits were brought to Australia in 1859 by colonists, with only 24 individuals. But the fluffy invaders belied all talks about their ability to multiply, and in 50 years, by the most daring estimates, they stamped out 600 million individuals, capturing the entire territory of the continent. The main blow came to the vegetation, which served as food for local animal species, which, in turn, led to the extinction of many Australian creatures. Moreover, entire forests disappeared because of the rabbits, as these voracious creatures completely destroyed the young shoots. Therefore, if you look at a map or satellite images from space, the vast desert areas are partly the result of the activity of millions of rabbits. This was not the first or the last time when humanity lacked the brains to understand that you can't bring new species of animals where they can disrupt natural food chains. But something had to be done. And they started with the fence. It cuts across virtually the entire map of Australia, passing through diverse landscapes from sandy deserts to picturesque hills, and is one of the largest artificial barriers in the world. Initially, the height of the fence was only 91 centimeters, but the jumping rabbits quickly proved that the barrier would have to be raised, so they added a wire loop. It's important to note that during the construction of the fence, there were clashes with the Aborigines, as the barriers passed through their traditional lands. Just building a fence to solve the problem was not enough. It was necessary to monitor its preservation and shoot the animal pests that sometimes managed to penetrate through the barrier. After all, rabbits not only jump high, but they are also excellent at digging tunnels. Moreover, Australians noticed that the fence held back kangaroos, emus, and dingo dogs. And this was good news for farmers, who constantly had their bred sheep stolen, attacking the herd. In the hunting gamble, dingo dogs cut far more sheep than they can eat. A small pack of dingoes can slaughter dozens of sheep in one night. The fight with the dogs began at the very beginning of the colonization of Australia, when the first sheep were brought to the continent. The fight is complicated by the nocturnal lifestyle of the dingo. They hide during the day and only hunt at night. Against the predators, they used traps, hunting nets, shot them, and poisoned them. By the end of the century, farmers in New South Wales were spending several tons of strychnine annually to fight wild dogs. A bounty of 2 shillings was paid for each animal killed. Castat, now up to 100 Australian dollars, is paid for a dog killed within the city limits. But all these measures proved to be insufficiently effective. In a short time, the dingo population increased 100-fold, posing a serious threat to the cattle population. Then the farmers added barbed wire, and by the year 1958, they decided to join forces altogether. Over time, the scattered fences joined together into one massive fence. Initially, the entire perimeter of the fence was patrolled by a group of watchers on horseback. They cleared a strip of land along the fence, cut down shrubs and trees on both sides, checked traps, and made sure that the gates, located 32 kilometers apart from each other, were closed. Over time, the camels also became a problem. With the advent of machines, the patrol camels were released into the wild, which led to their multiplication and turned into an additional threat to the ecosystem. By the way, today, the patrol uses off-road vehicles and quad bikes. Yes, and they do not neglect modern technologies either. For example, a virtual fence that successfully protects animals from collisions with cars. Tasmania, an Australian state, has some of the best quality roads in the country. Scientists are developing a virtual road barrier consisting of signal blocks located at a distance of 2.5 meters from the Earth and emitting warning noise and light signals. During 3 years of testing, thanks to such a virtual barrier, the state managed to reduce the number of animal collisions with cars by 50%. That is, to save the lives of approximately 200 wombats, possums, and other representatives of Australia's fauna. Virtual fences turned out to be much more effective and, what is no less important, much cheaper than what was previously road signs, speed bumps, and special crossings. Such innovative systems are easily installed and spread their action over significant sections of the road. So protection technologies are applied even in such a field. Not to mention digital technologies. By the time of the construction of the huge fence, Australians seem to have acquired some chaotic dependence on barriers. Judge for yourself! Now, in addition to huge fences from large animals, Australians have added to the list of places with a sign "Animals Entry Prohibited" and water intakes. This time for protection against box jellyfish. In Europe, these amphibians are on the verge of extinction, but they were recently introduced to Australia. Like rabbits in their time, the frogs multiplied quickly, filled the state of Queensland, and now have launched an invasion to the northwest. For example, there is a national park on the Coburg Peninsula. Scientists fear a repeat of history, worrying that many species of insects and small animals will be exterminated. A 9-kilometer fence should stop the beetles' advance, which will cut across the forest. Toads can't jump, but they dig deep enough burrows. That's why a concrete wall just over 0.5 meter high should be almost as deep in the ground. Who else do you think the Australians have fenced off from? Another wall is not very grandiose, only 44 kilometers long, but very high, up to 3 meters. It surrounds the New Haven National Park. The wall is designed to serve as a barrier to feral cats, which, as you've already guessed, were also brought to the continent. Some cats escaped from Australian farmers and multiplied to 12 million individuals. It is estimated that every day, wild cats kill more than 3 million birds, reptiles, and mammals, about 2,000 per minute. Biologists annually draw sad conclusions about the incredible number of cats. It is believed that precisely because of them, 27 species of animals have died out. In the end, by the year 2018, the fence was built, and now the situation with the cats has calmed down. There is one sad, even scary, result of all these fences and barriers. In fact, many animals are deprived of the opportunity to freely migrate across the continent, and someone needs to look for new habitats or escape from natural disasters. Along the fence, you can see the bones of animals like dingoes, kangaroos, and others that get stuck in the net. All this chain of problems, starting with rabbits and ending with cats, is not the most important one, in essence. It's important that the construction of fences has become an interference in the natural selection. In essence, now, on one side of the fence, predators reign supreme, and on the other, under the protection of people, herbivores multiply. Moreover, this iron curtain has affected the evolution of kangaroos. Scientists have noticed that those kangaroos, which are protected by a fence and are not forced to run from dingoes, grow much slower. Many generations of kangaroos had the incentive to grow large and strong quickly in order to withstand dingoes or run away from them. But now, to the southeast of the fence, only foxes remain from the predators. So, in some distant future, perhaps, the protected kangaroo may decide not to grow larger than a fox. And if now take and remove the fences all over Australia, then the predators will simply sweep away the unprepared, who have lived in safety for decades. All these rabbits, cats, and toads are just a small part of the problems with the animal world that may arise in the future. After all, the example of these same rabbits shows how the uncontrolled multiplication of one species can affect an entire continent. Imagine if people in Europe or Asia had fenced off certain types of animals. Who knows what kind of forests or animal species we would be missing now? there is another notable change related to the fence. On its different sides, not only the animals and the number of plants differ, but even the landscape, specifically the shape of the sand dunes. Scientists describe this as a domino effect. South of the fence, the dingo population has drastically declined. In the absence of dingoes in these regions, the number of invasive predatory species such as foxes and wildcats has sharply increased. In turn, due to them, the number of small rodents and marsupials has fallen. These animals fed on plant seeds and small shrubs, which without them began to grow in larger quantities. The growing shrubs allowed shade-loving plants to survive, such as hams or shayniks. The emerging vegetation strengthened the structural integrity of the sand dunes and affected their movement under the influence of the wind. As a result, the dunes to the south of the fence over time became higher and took on a different shape. Probably in another couple of decades, worms will settle in these dunes. The Australian fence even got its role in a movie called Rabbit-Proof Fence. The fence in the title refers to the actual fence itself. According to the plot, in 1931, 3 Australian Aboriginal girls escape from a harsh encampment to meet their mother. They have to walk along that very fence for several weeks. In addition to the so-called barrier issue, Australians had another serious problem with animals. And not just with animals, but with their current national symbol, the emu. After the end of World War I, many Australian veterans were given permission by the authorities to engage in farming. They were allocated unused lands in the west of the country, and wheat was designated as the main agricultural crop. As we remember, to protect the crops from wild rabbits, multi-kilometer fences were installed. But another threat emerged. Until the Great Depression, the thousands of farmers did not bother the government. Everything was stable. But soon, the country was engulfed by the stock market crash that began in the United States of America. The risk of famine appeared on the continent, and the Australian government turned to the farmers with a request to sharply increase the supply of grain crops. This required cultivating lands far away from human settlements. Fortunately, the government provided subsidies. The additional lands were plowed, significantly increasing the yield. However, instead of the promised subsidies, emus arrived. Every year after this stage of breeding, the birds migrated from the central regions to the coast. And there on their usual path appeared those very first anti-rolling fences. Large birds easily broke through the flimsy fences, and about 20,000 emus ended up on the farmers' fields. The emus indulged in free grazing on the rich grain fields, which of course caused irreparable damage to the future crop. For some time, the farmers tried to fight the pests on their own. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that rabbits burrowed into the holes in the fences. In the end, the farmers had to ask the government for help, and the authorities had to intervene. In 1932, the fight against the birds was escalated to the point where the 1st Division, an armed military unit that arrived on trucks, was equipped with machine guns and even artillery. Propagandists, expecting a quick victory, sent a cameraman for filming, and the emu feathers were declared trophies in advance, as they were used to make fashionable hat decorations. However, the start of the operation coincided with heavy rains, which allowed the birds to regroup. The rains only stopped after a month, when the machine gunners finally noticed the first column of emus. The birds, having stumbled upon a poorly organized ambush, quickly retreated, and the machine gun fire proved ineffective. The soldiers quickly realized that dealing with such maneuverable targets would be difficult. In the following days, the soldiers improvised as best they could, mounting machine guns on vehicles, trying to trap the birds, but to no avail. In the first 6 days of fighting, a senseless 2,500 rounds were used, and the number of emus injured barely reached half a dozen. The capital was in turmoil, and after the first failed wave, the Australian army retreated. As if accepting the challenge, the ostriches threw themselves into the sowing with redoubled fury. The returning soldiers continued to chase the emu until the commander was called to report to the government. He reported that nearly 1,000 birds were destroyed during the operation, with about 10,000 shots fired. That is, at least 10 rounds were needed for each emu. After this performance, Defense Minister George Pierce was dubbed the Defense Minister from EMU. The military argued that the dense feathering masks the actual body targets, making it very difficult to hit the unfortunate birds. It was also surprising that the EMUs continued to move quickly, even with severe injuries. In the newspapers and on television, they openly laughed at the Great War with the EMUs, and the people became increasingly outraged. British environmentalists began to organize protests against the destruction of the EMUs. Leading ornithologists of the world called all this an attempt at mass destruction of a rare species of birds. In the Australian Parliament, they became interested in whether the government should cancel the medal for participants of that war, and added that the awards rightfully belonged to the EMUs who won this war. Politicians were concerned about who should pay for the wasted ammunition, while the birds continued to attack the crops. And all this against the backdrop of a deepening crisis. It got to the point where the desperate farmers suggested bombing the pests from airplanes, which, of course, was refused. As a result, the farmers had to take matters into their own hands. After an agreement with the civil company and the government, the regional authorities declared a high reward for each EMU destroyed. Many birds were destroyed afterwards, but the fence was also perfected, so the battle ended. And by the end of the 90s, wild EMUs came under state protection. This is how a movie on this topic might appear on the big screen or on Netflix. But for emus, cockatoos, dingo dogs, and kangaroos, these are just part of the animals that can be encountered in the expanses of Australia. And, frankly speaking, not the most dangerous part. Let's see what creatures can await an unsuspecting tourist. Unfriendly Flora. In Australia, you should expect a sneak attack even from plants. For example, you still need to get past the Araucaria alive. In Australia, on this historical competitor, trees grow such large fruits that it's quite reasonable to walk through local forests with a helmet on your head. Scientists have calculated that over 2,000 plants found in Australia are toxic or poisonous. Ever come across this ostrich-like tree somewhere? This beautiful fruit, reminiscent of a gourd, will cause paralysis, convulsions, and even fatal outcome if eaten. It's all about the poisonous strychnine, which is contained in the seeds inside the fruits. While the Russian Rapiva is turning into plastic, its Australian counterpart Gimpy Gimpy will not be ceremonious with you. And instead of a few hours or days of burns, as happens with ordinary nettle, it will arrange an attraction for several months. Gimpy Gimpy is considered the most poisonous plant in Australia. Its fluffy, soft leaves are heart-shaped and, at first glance, harmless, gentle bristles. These are the same dangerous needles. They are very thin, like hair, and each needle contains a toxin so powerful that it will make a person writhe in pain. These needles are so sharp that they stick very firmly and stay in the skin for a long time. It's not always possible to remove them completely. And as long as they are in the body, they will constantly cause excruciating pain. When you touch the wound, if it gets wet or exposed to sunlight. Moreover, the needles do not settle on the earth. They are very light and remain suspended in the air near the victim. So an unsuspecting victim can simply inhale these fine hairs and not immediately understand what is happening. There will only be symptoms of aches, sneezing fits, watery eyes and nose, severe cough, throat pain, and, in the end, a severe allergic reaction. Interestingly, the Australian stinging tree is a source of food for the red-legged padamelon, a small kangaroo about 50 centimeters tall. Overnight, the animal is able to chew an entire bush completely without harm to its health, as it has immunity to the stings. These divine cows inside the structures are actually the fruits of the most dangerous plant, the crab's eye. The poison contained in it acts for several days after entering the body and can cause vomiting and bloody diarrhea. If you do not see a doctor in time, a person will start to experience severe dehydration, blood pressure drops, hallucinations may begin, and seizures. As a result, death often occurs from kidney or liver failure. Medical tests have shown that arbon is 30 times more toxic than ricin, a military poison used by special services of various countries for their dirty deeds. Australian flora is extraordinarily unpredictable, as was the case in the Well, Wait a Minute series with the magic apple. Similar adventures await you if you get lost and decide to snack on Australian fruits. For example, yellow jasmine can cause severe diarrhea, and the milky sap of the mangrove tree can cause temporary blindness. The beautiful lily leads to a terrible stomach upset. The list can go on indefinitely. We can conclude the section on flora with advice from Australian naturalists on how to properly consume local plants as food. First of all, do not eat the same plants that local birds feed on, because our digestive tract is different from a bird's. Crush the soft stems or leaves of the plants around you, and choose a plant with the least sharp smell. Moisten a small piece of skin, say, on the inside of the elbow, with the juice of this plant. And if the skin does not turn red, and there is no rash, then try this juice with the tip of your tongue. Then wait a few minutes. If your throat swells up or burns, spit out the plant. If this doesn't happen, then chew it, but then still spit it out. If after a few minutes you still feel fine, then you can start eating this plant. It's best to cook and consume it in minimal amounts to alleviate hunger. If after 6 hours you don't feel bad, then you can eat this plant again. It seems that so many instructions are only found in human medicines. Don't mess with Australia. Australian plants have one big advantage over other forms of life. They are usually static and don't try to chase you, at least for now. But if we're talking about wildlife, not even on land, but in the water, and small-sized wildlife at that, then you can consider it gone. For example, 16-year-old Sam Kanesi became a victim of unknown sea creatures that bit his legs. Swimming at the beach, the young man thought that the minor burns on his legs were due to the cold water. When he came out of the water and looked at his legs, he almost fainted. Turns out, his legs were bitten by tiny living organisms. Coming out of the water, the guy noticed that his legs were covered with numerous bleeding wounds, and he went home. Since he couldn't stop the bleeding on his own, his parents took him to the hospital where he received medical help. Everything was fine with Sam afterwards. However, specialists were long puzzled over who bit him. Biologists and doctors concluded that these were crayfish, also known as sea lice. They lead a parasitic lifestyle and mainly feed on fish scales and other marine animals. But there is an even more terrifying creature that lives off the coast of Australia, and it is considered one of the deadliest in the world. This is the Irukandji jellyfish. The story goes that at the end of the 19th century, people began to die en masse on the beaches of Queensland, and children suffered the most. Death came instantly, and the doctors who arrived could only throw up their hands. Sudden cardiac arrest. All these deaths went into the realm of myths and were embellished with various invented details. Hence the name. The Australian Aborigines of the Irukandji tribe were convinced that all deaths were caused by a demon causing unbearable pain to people. Everything changed in 1955 when another sudden child death occurred. Australian doctor and biologist Hugo Flecker, upon hearing about the tragedy, ordered rescuers to take nets and catch all the marine life that could be found near the shore. Among the water plants, fish, and shrimp, Flecker, unexpectedly for himself and the entire scientific world, found the culprit of this and all previous mysterious child deaths. The invisible killer and demons of Irukandji turned out to be the previously unknown jellyfish. The scientist classified the specimen as a representative of the Cuba Medusa order. Unlike other species, this specimen had a cubic-shaped bell, with a small tentacle hanging from each corner of the cube. In the laboratory, Flecker placed the jellyfish in an aquarium and discovered that it was completely transparent. The scientist was able to see it again only under an ultraviolet lamp. In this, the locals turned out to be right. The killer was indeed invisible. Unlike the usual jellyfish, which calmly drifts in the ocean, the cube jellyfish moves incredibly fast. From its body hang 60 long tentacles, which form a poisonous web up to 4.5 meters long. Upon contact with a victim, millions of nematocysts, special cells for protection and hunting, are fired into the body of the fish or the person who happened to be nearby. You might ask, why were there no signs of a sting on the bodies? It turns out that in a calm state, the tentacles of a jellyfish are no more than 15 centimeters long, but when hunting, the tentacles can increase several times to a full 4 to 5 meters. If a swimmer is unlucky enough to get under the tentacles of a hunting jellyfish, bright, pronounced marks appear on his body instantly. But if you encounter a box jellyfish, only a cross-shaped mark remains on the body. But this tiny burn is enough for it to kill. The venom of this jellyfish is a whole biological cocktail, a small amount of which can easily kill up to 60 adult men. Its composition includes tetrodotoxin, which paralyzes nerve endings, phthalocin disrupts blood vessels and shuts down the lungs, and hypnotoxin shuts off the nervous system. Even if a person doesn't die immediately after being stung, they are still practically doomed. Approximately 0.4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight is already a lethal dose for an adult, so even accidental contact with the tentacles causes unbearable pain. On the beach in Queensland, they even put up a special sign warning of the possible appearance of box jellyfish in the water from October to March. But the residents of Queensland still want to swim, and scientists have come up with a safe way specifically for them. It turns out that tentacles, jellyfish, and sea anemones do not perceive nylon fabric as living, and the nematocysts simply do not fire. Queensland lifeguards took note of this and armed themselves with nylon stockings, and business picked up the idea and started producing full nylon suits that cover the entire body. And there is still a lot to tell about Australian animals. And we can do this. We already have the material. Write in the comments if you are interested, and we will put it to work. In addition to the fence in Australia, there is another mystery on the internet, the wall in Antarctica, for which research expeditions regularly go, and none of them return. We also have an interesting issue about Antarctica. We recommend watching it if you haven't yet.